Okay, good morning, people. How we doing this morning? I see Baha was here well before me even. So good morning, Baha. Um, Morning, Monica. Morning, Tika. Who else is here? Manish is here. Good morning. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Good morning, Casey. And good morning, Nashid. Um, all right. So hopefully some more people will trickle in a few minutes. Um, what we'll do today I think will be pretty important because there are a few things that we will talk about today, a few things that we'll learn that are, I think, very important to understanding how this course works. Um, Good morning. That is Lily, right? Good morning, Lily. Um, there are there are parts of this course that, yeah, this is a part of the course that is going to be important, and I think it is when we talk about oppression in society. And so obviously racism is the one that immediately comes to mind because of what's happened in the United States and all the protests surrounding it. Um, there are things that people very easily understand about racism, and then I think there are things that people do not quite understand about racism because they're not as clear, they're not as obvious. Sometimes they're a little counterintuitive, and you can see people. Um, if you're following what's happening in the United States and you're following um, people's response to what's happened to George Floyd and um, what people are saying and how people are talking about um, the circumstances of his death and how people are talking about the protests that are happening now. Good morning, Duong. Um, if you're following that, you'll see that there are some people who have done a good job of speaking in support of what's happening, speaking in support of the protesters, and speaking in support of Black Americans. And then there's people who haven't really done a good job of saying what they need to say. And part of it has to do with what we'll talk about today. Part of it has to do, I think anyway, with a little bit of a misunderstanding about how systemic racism operates. Okay, and we'll get a little bit of a peek at that today. So again, I think this is an important, today's material is important for us in this course and understanding how oppression works, but it's also, I think, important for us in greater society because, again, many people have some sort of an understanding of how different types of oppression work, but there's also things that they don't understand as well. And so this will be kind of a first step for us in trying to understand how oppression operates and why it's kind of sometimes difficult to see and confusing to understand. Okay. So good morning to you, Justin. Good morning. Yeah, so let's dive in. We'll do that, and then I'll talk for a little bit. I have a short thing for you to read, maybe about halfway through the class or so, on the concept of privilege, which is another tricky and maybe confusing concept for some of us. We'll talk about privilege, and then I'll talk about that little micro paper assignment that I would like you to do. So three things today, okay? Okay, let's dive into it. So yesterday, you'll remember we were talking about stereotypes and prejudices and discrimination, right? And we said that stereotypes are kind of reduced or simplified characteristics of a group. And sometimes it's a characteristic that stands out. Sometimes it's a characteristic that we sort of just attach to groups. But usually they have no positive or negative judgments attached to them, okay? And so basically we say that, because we see someone, we see what they look like or what social group they belong to, and stereotypes tell us that we know something about them just because of how they look or just because of the social group that they belong to. That's what stereotypes do. And again, usually there's no positive or negative association with it. And so the example I like to use a lot is Canadians say a all the time, right? They say a at the end of their sentences. And that's neither good nor bad. It's just an observation. And again, there is a grain of truth to that stereotype. Some of us say a. I think we say a lot less than we used to years ago. Maybe we became conscious and embarrassed of the stereotype, and so us Canadians tried not to say it. Nevertheless, it's a stereotype, and it doesn't really have a positive or a negative connotation. It just kind of exists. Ben America, good morning. So that's what a stereotype was, right? We said prejudices were similar, but prejudices were connected to our emotions, were connected to feeling, and they functioned in a way that we could pass judgment on other people. And so prejudices kind of begin with stereotypes, but then we attach negative things to them, okay? And so prejudices are kind of much more dangerous because they sort of engage people in judgment, right? Either positively or probably more often negatively judging other people based on how they appear or based on the social group that they belong to, okay? And then finally, we talked about discrimination. And so this is where you act on your prejudice. And so the preconceived ideas you have about someone based on how they appear or the social group they belong to leads you to behave in a certain way, okay? And so it might cause you to say something, it might cause you to do something, or it might cause you to not say something or not do something when you should. So one way or the other, we discriminate when we base our behavior on our prejudicial ideas, okay? That's what discrimination is. Action based on prejudice. And again, it could be positive or negative. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Positive or negative instances of discrimination, okay? Yeah, so prejudice comes into play when we assign value to our stereotypes, when we make judgments about people based on our stereotypical ideas. And sometimes the big problem with prejudicial ideas within a society is that often they become normalized, okay? And so the danger here is that if everybody believes something to be true, then it functions as if it is true, okay? It doesn't really matter if it is objectively true or not. That's the difficulty of dealing with humans and human culture and human society, is that if we all believe something exists or something to be the case, then there's almost no difference. There's almost no difference as if it was true, okay? And so the example here might be Jane Elliott's class with her brown-eyed and blue-eyed kids. Of course, the brown-eyed kids were not necessarily smarter than the blue-eyed kids, but because all the kids believed that to be true, the test scores showed that the brown-eyed kids were doing better. It looked as if they were smarter. And so even though the brown-eyed kids weren't necessarily smarter, because everyone believed it may as well have been true, because that's how that little class, that's how that little society behaved, right? And so that's why prejudicial ideas are dangerous, because sometimes they have a way of sort of manifesting themselves. They have a way of kind of coming true because of the way that humans behave based on their ideas, okay? The other thing that's tricky about prejudice is that society tells us that it's bad, right? We feel that, I think we all know, or we have all been socialized to believe that stereotypes are bad, prejudice is bad, discrimination against certain people is bad, and so we shouldn't do it, right? Good morning, Ivan, and good morning, Erica. We've all been socialized to believe that we shouldn't do those things, right? We shouldn't be prejudicial. And so because of that, there's a very strong temptation for us to push that idea away, right? There's a lot of social pressure for me and for all of us to say that I am not prejudiced. I have no prejudicial ideas. I don't discriminate against people. There's a lot of social pressure for me to say that. And so what that does, unfortunately, is that it makes it more difficult to talk about. It makes it more difficult to identify prejudicial ideas because everybody wants to kind of deny that they exist and deny that they hold them, okay? We'll come to that later too. But like I mentioned yesterday, and I'll just go through this really quickly, the acceptance of prejudice varies over time, okay? And so some people will express their prejudice more if they think it is factual, okay? And so the example I was saying is that once upon a time, well, maybe not even once upon a time, but decades ago, it was much more socially acceptable for white people to admit that they held prejudicial beliefs against black people. I won't show it now because showing videos is a little more complicated in this online format. But I do have a video of, I think it's from the 1940s, in a little community called Levittown, Kentucky, and it is it's a white neighborhood. It was a brand new neighborhood that everyone had just moved into, and it was all white. There were all white people living in it, except for one black family who had moved in. A family of, I think the mother and father were engineers, and they had 2 kids or 3 kids or something like that, and they were doing interviews around the neighborhood, and it was pretty shocking because some people were very comfortable expressing their prejudice against this black family that had moved into the neighborhood. They felt they shouldn't be there. They felt that property values would go down. They thought there would be trouble if they stayed. I don't know what kind of trouble they were talking about, but the people they were interviewing felt there would be trouble. And so it was really weird to see because people were very comfortable expressing this prejudice. Of course, now, the social climate being what it is, even if people hold sort of prejudicial or racist ideas about black people, most people know better than to say them out loud, especially in front of a camera, right? Most people know not to say it. And so, Hossam, good morning to you. But the reason they were so comfortable saying it is because these people actually felt that they were not expressing prejudice. They thought they were expressing fact. They actually believed that black people were inferior to white people. And so they didn't feel they were saying anything wrong. They felt like they were just saying what was true. And of course, we know that not to be true. But that was why they were so comfortable saying it. And to make a comparison, I said that currently there is a lot of prejudice against people who are overweight, and especially women. And so we don't have to look very far to see people very comfortably expressing their prejudice against people who are overweight. And so we see lots of hurtful comments. These are just a few that I was able to find. But people express these prejudices against people who are overweight because they feel that they're based on fact. They feel that people are overweight because they are lazy or undisciplined, or they don't care about their health, or they're stupid, or whatever, right? So there's all these kind of prejudicial and stereotypical ideas about what people who are overweight are like inside, and people are judging them on it, right? And people feel very comfortable doing that because they think it's fact, right? They think that people are overweight because they're lazy or undisciplined, right? That's the kind of idea behind all of this. And so because they believe that to be true, they feel very comfortable expressing their prejudicial ideas. Um, but of course, if we dig under the surface a little bit, we find that, well, that's not entirely true, right? Your activity does have something to do with your weight, and the food you eat does have something to do with your weight. But there are a lot of other elements to that equation in terms of environment and genetics and socioeconomic class and all kinds of things. And so people very clearly, again, express this prejudice, and there's a lot of economic benefit in promoting this prejudicial idea too, right? Because there's a massive industry that is based on beauty and fitness and health, right? There's billions and billions and billions of dollars that is generated by people trying to be healthier, trying to be fitter, trying to be thinner. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. I think it's good to be healthy, and it's good to feel good about yourself. But the downside of this is that this industry is making its money based on promoting the idea that if you are overweight, you're a bad person. Okay? That's the idea behind this, and that's kind of the hidden idea that's used to sell a lot of these products. And that's dangerous, right? That's dangerous and hurtful to people, and particularly it's dangerous and hurtful to young girls. And so there's increasing data and increasing stories out there that, of course, women are. There's a lot of pressure on women to look a certain way, and that pressure is kind of being downloaded to younger and younger girls. So girls who have not even reached puberty, so girls who are 9 or 10 or 11 years old are dieting and are worried about their body. And 9-year-old girls do not need to be worried about those things, but because there is social messaging circulating that tells girls that it's very important for them to be pretty and to be slim, these girls are absorbing those social messages, right? And they are behaving in accordance with them. Yeah, okay, that's all I'll say for now. There might be more to say about that when we get to sexism, but we'll leave that for now. Okay, and we said discrimination is action based on the prejudices you have toward others. Now, of course, how we think about other people, what our prejudices are, determines how we behave. But when we when we treat people based on our prejudices, we are discriminating. And so it might mean saying something. It might mean making jokes. It might mean spreading rumors. It might mean threatening people. It might actually mean violence. Or it might be the opposite, right? It might be actually ignoring someone or not listening to them, okay? So any kind of action we take based on our prejudice is discrimination. Now, what I'll talk about now is another study that was done, another academic study. And what I want to point out to you here is that what we're kind of talking about, and what I often talk about in this course, is the ways in which oppression and discrimination and prejudice, the way in which they're a little more hidden and a little more difficult to see and difficult to understand. I think that we all have a good grasp of, let's say, what racism is, right? When you hear someone say something racist, you know what it is, right? When something racist happens on the news, you very clearly understand it for what it is. And so I try not to focus too much on the really obvious stuff, because I think that we all sort of intuitively understand, what is and isn't racist for the most part. So what I'm looking at is kind of more subtle things. So do people discriminate against other people on purpose? Absolutely, right? People who are very strongly racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim. Some people very clearly discriminate on purpose, and they know they're doing it. Okay, and again, I think that's easier for us to understand. But what I want to talk about is the stuff that's a little less easy to understand. Okay, so let me talk about this study. Okay, so this is a journal article. It's back from 2004. There's actually lots of studies that are like this. And the title of the study here is, Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? And so these two scientists here, Marianne Bertrand and Senthil Mulianathan, probably mispronounced their last name, I'm sorry. They conducted, good morning, Jimmy. They conducted a study, and here's what they did. Okay, these are two academics, two professors out of the University of Chicago, and they conducted a little experiment. Okay, and what they did was they created 5,000 resumes. Okay, 5,000 resumes. These resumes are totally fictional. Okay, these people don't exist. They just made up the resumes, but they made them look good and believable. And what they did was they replied to help wanted ads. They replied to job ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers. And they sent out these resumes, and the credentials and the experience on the resumes were similar. Okay, so depending on the job that you were applying to, they sent a resume that was reasonable and that, you know, the person had the experience and credentials to actually get the job. The only real difference between these resumes was that they used stereotypically white or black sounding names. And so in the United States, names like Greg Baker or Emily Walsh, those are kind of names that probably belong to white people. Okay, and half of the resumes got names that sounded stereotypically black. And so Jamal Jones, Lakeisha Washington are much more associated with black Americans than white Americans. So we have 5,000 resumes go out. Depending on the job, the credentials and experiences are basically the same. The only thing that's different is the name. And on half of them, the names sound white. On half of them, the names sound black. So I'll ask you, what do you think happened? What do you think happened? Do you think the white names got more callbacks? Do you think the black names got more callbacks? Or do you think it was kind of equal, kind of 50-50? What do you think happened? What do you think happened after sending out all of these resumes? Casey says, white people got accepted more. Okay. What else? Other bets? Do you want to bet money? Erica says white names got more feedback. Baha says white names got more callbacks. Karen, okay, depends on the job. The good ones, white sounding names were more accepted. Okay, that's an interesting observation, and I could see how that could happen. What else do you think? Let's give you a few more seconds here. Okay, so you are basically correct. As it turned out, white names got called back much more often. Okay, so what does that show us? Well, it shows us that there is racial discrimination in hiring, right? So the researchers did this a few different times, and so they sent out the original resumes, and they monitored who got called for an interview. And again, the white sounding names got called for an interview much more than the black sounding names. And then they kind of repeated the experiment, and what they did was they sent the resumes out, but actually the resumes with the black sounding names, they actually had slightly more experience, and their credentials were actually a little bit better. And sadly, it didn't really matter. Even when their credentials and experience were increased and they were more qualified, black applicants still were discriminated against. And what's interesting, and here's where Karen, I think you had a good thought there, but the study doesn't support you. The study doesn't support you on this one. But the study shows that the discrimination stayed consistent across industry types. And so the researchers here were sending out resumes for, architectural firms, for nursing jobs, for bus drivers, for dishwashers in a restaurant, maybe some teachers. And so it was kind of all levels of the economic spectrum. So some very kind of professional, high-paying jobs, to some sort of middle-range jobs, to sort of lower wage and unskilled jobs. So they were kind of sampling all across the economic or the professional spectrum. They tried it in 2 cities. They tried it in Chicago, where they were stationed, and they tried it in Boston. And they found that the pattern held up across industry types, and even between the 2 cities. They found similar things in that white names got more callbacks, and black names did not. So what's going on here, right? Here we see a little experiment done, and again, it's not the only one of its type. There's lots of experiments like this. What's going on, right? Is everyone a racist, right? Are all of these HR managers and business owners, are they racists? And this study and probably many other studies would say yes and no. Okay, and this is where it gets complicated, and this is one of the things that we need to understand. So in this study, we sent out the resumes, and we got more callbacks for white names than black names. Now, are some of those business owners and human resource managers, are some of them racist? Yeah, probably are, right? There's always a few. I'm sure some of them are. But most of them are probably not consciously or purposely trying to discriminate, okay? Probably it is happening more unconsciously or by accident, okay? So I'll try and explain this to you. So clearly we have a problem with racism in the United States and in Canada as well, but we'll just stick with the US for the moment. So if we asked all of those business owners and HR managers, if we asked them, hey, did you just call these people back because they sounded white? Most people would say no. And most of them would not be lying. Most of them would have thought that they were being objective, that they were being unbiased. But this is where socialization becomes important, okay? This is where all of that talk about socialization and social messages acting like viruses or malware, this is where it actually comes into play. It's likely that the HR managers and the business owners were discriminating, but without really knowing it, okay? And so what's probably happening here is that when these managers are reviewing the resumes, those applications with the names of Black Americans activate a set of racial filters, okay? And so we can think about these filters, and again, these filters would work for any minoritized group, okay? So we might look at, any minoritized group will be looked at through a set of filters. And so imagine these, you ever seen those clip-on sunglasses? You know, you have your regular glasses on and then you can clip on the sunglasses so they kind of flip down. They're kind of nerdy, but you've probably seen them. If you wear flip down sunglasses, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say they were nerdy. Think about them that way, okay? And so what happens here is that all of the kind of stereotypes and prejudicial ideas that are associated with different minoritized groups kind of form a set of filters. And so when the HR managers are looking through these resumes one after the other, and then they see the name Lakeisha Washington, immediately their brain associates that with the name of a black person. And then what kind of happens, without even really meaning to, this happens kind of subconsciously without us knowing, those lenses kind of flip down. And all of a sudden, the HR manager is looking at the resume through a lens of stereotype and prejudice, okay? He or she is interpreting the resume based on these sort of stereotypical associations about what we think we know about Black Americans, okay? And so all of those credentials, all of that experience on the resumes with the black sounding names are interpreted through this filter, okay? And so they are seen differently. They actually see these resumes differently. And so it's very likely that people would not have noticed that these filters were activated, okay? Because a lot of this stuff happens automatically in our brain, okay? We have very sophisticated and very fast-acting kind of brain machinery. So I don't want to go into this. This is a whole Daniel Kahneman thing, but you can look him up later. We have very quick-acting parts of our brain that are good at making judgments, assessing situations, coming to decisions really quickly. And a lot of that happens really without us being consciously aware. We don't really know what's happening, it just happens. And most of us go through most of our day with that part of our brain running. And again, it's very good at taking in a lot of information. It's very good at making quick judgments. It's very good at understanding the environment that it's in. And so that system is active here. And so these HR managers are kind of making decisions and getting impressions from these resumes without even really knowing what they're doing or how they're doing it for the most part. And so again, these lenses kind of flip down without anybody's knowledge, and they start to influence the way that people see the resumes, okay? Now, the question might be, are there racial filters triggered for white-sounding names? And the answer here is no. And this is why, and this is not a race thing, this is a dominant versus minoritized group thing. We'll come back to this a number of times, and it might make sense right now and it might not. But dominant groups are usually seen as the default thing, okay? The neutral thing. And so you can think about this with white people, you can think about this with men, you can think about this with heterosexuals. The dominant group is seen as kind of value neutral, okay? So there are kind of no obvious racial filters that get activated with white-sounding names, okay? Because again, the white-sounding names are the default. They're neutral, they're blank. And so when the HR managers are flipping through these resumes, when they see a resume with a white person's name at the top, really they're just seeing the resume, okay? They're not being influenced one way or the other based on the name because there are no obvious social messages around it. And so the HR manager is just looking at the credentials and the experience that are on the resume. But again, when the black sounding name shows up at the top of the resume, those filters come down, and all of a sudden the HR manager is interpreting those credentials and that experience through the lens of what we know, quote unquote, about black people in America. Okay? And so the resumes are not seen exactly the same way. And it might sound weird. But that seems to be the way it works. And so, as I mentioned, dominant groups don't have similar lenses. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about, again, white people or heterosexuals or Christians or men, whatever dominant group you're referring to, they are seen as the default. They're seen as kind of normal. They're seen as kind of value neutral. And so the resumes of the white people in this case actually look better because there are no negative associations with them. In fact, there's no associations with them at all. They just look as they look. But the resumes of black people are interpreted through this filter, okay, through the stereotypical ideas of what we think we know about black people in America, okay? Now, a little audience participation. I got a quick question for you. This handsome looking gentleman here, who hopefully you know who he is, former President Barack Obama. Is Barack Obama black or is he white? What do you think? This might sound like an easy question, but maybe it's not. But tell me what you think. Okay, Karen says he's black. Erica says he's black. Tika says he's black. Okay. Okay. Sheed, black. Anish, black. Okay. KC, all right. Okay. extra black. Okay. All right. So I would agree with you. I think Barack Obama is black, and I think that he's, for the most part, he's presented himself that way, right? He has identified himself as a black man, and so that's who he thinks he is, and I think that's how I see him, and clearly that's how most of us see him as well. But very interestingly, the answer is not quite so simple, okay? And it's not simple. It's complicated, not for the reason you might think. So Barack Obama is, if you wanted to really split hairs, technically he's a mixed race person, right? So his father is black. I think his father is from Kenya, if I recall. And his mother is a white woman, and she's from the United States, but I forget what state. I remember he's born in Hawaii. I'm not sure I don't think she's from Hawaii though. So if you wanted to really be specific, you might say he is a mixed race person. Baha says he's a brownish person, saying, yeah, okay, and not stereotypically, okay. That's true, right? That's true too, Karen, is that he, we might have stereotypes about how black men act or behave or kind of what they're like. And Barack Obama doesn't fit all of those stereotypes, right? He doesn't manifest all those stereotypes. We can probably deal with that later, but I think you're correct there. So yeah, if we wanted to split hairs on Barack Obama, we would say that he's a mixed race person. He identifies himself in public. Part of his identity, he identifies himself as a black man. And I think most people accept that about him, and I think most of us see him that way. However, the answer to this question is not so simple. It actually depends. Different people see him differently. And so a recent study was done here. I don't seem to have the reference. A recent study was done, and what they did was they showed Americans pictures of Obama. And what they did with President Obama is they photoshopped him a little bit. Okay, and so in some photos they kind of lightened his skin a shade or two, and in some photos they darkened his skin a shade or two, and then some of them they just left them alone, so they were at his actual skin tone. And so they kind of mixed all of these photos up, some of them edited, some of them not, and they asked people in a psychological study, which photo do you think best represents what Barack Obama looks like? And so people chose whichever photo they thought looked most representative of him. And then they asked these people a number of questions, and that's where it got interesting. What happened is that there seemed to be a difference in how people saw Barack Obama based on their political views. And so the students that they asked, the ones that were liberals, so the ones that were Democrats, and Barack Obama is a Democrat, that's the party he belongs to. So students who belonged to the same kind of political party or had similar political views to Barack Obama, they actually saw him as being lighter skinned than he actually was, or they chose photos that were more in which his skin looked lighter. And interestingly, students who are conservatives, and so these are Republicans, people who are on the other side, people who are not part of Barack Obama's political party, they actually thought the photos that were most accurate of him were the photos in which he looked a little bit darker. Which is really interesting, right? And they say here that you can see this effect even if you adjust for racial prejudice, so it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether the person looking at the photos is racist or not. And it works with people who are even not famous, okay? And interestingly, the people who associated Obama with the lighter photos were more likely to vote for him. So that's weird, right? Because the man is one color. He's not a chameleon, right? He doesn't change color all the time. He's one man, but people are, based on their political views and based on how closely those views align with Barack Obama's views, they actually see him differently. They actually see him as a slightly different color, which is really interesting. And so what's going on, right? Clearly, people's eyes are not, all weird. Clearly, Barack Obama is not changing color on a day-to-day basis. So what's going on? Well, the leader of the study here, Eugene Caruso, thinks that there's a couple of things happening. And this is part of the racial filter thing that I was talking about, okay? So Eugene Caruso, the leader of the study, suggests that there are positive associations with whiteness and lightness in Western culture. So the lighter one's skin is, the more preferred that is, or the more they're seen as kind of a good person. And the darker skin they are, the kind of less favorable it is, okay? And again, I'm definitely not saying that's true, but I'm saying that's kind of the underlying hidden idea that people may have absorbed. And again, that would be a social message that no one ever taught, right? That would be a social message that people absorbed really without knowing it. But Eugene Caruso says here that there are positive associations with whiteness and lightness. And so people who like Obama would be more likely to see him as lighter, or would be more likely to pick the photos in which his skin appeared lighter, which is interesting. I haven't done the study myself, but I like Barack Obama, and so I wonder if it would work on me. I wonder if I did the study, if I would choose a photo in which his skin appeared lighter, even though I like to think of myself as not racist and I like Obama, I respect him, but I wonder if it would work. I don't know. Caruso also says that there is a tendency to view people of the same group as more favorable, right? And that's actually connected to that Tajfeld's social identity theory, if you remember when we read in the article yesterday or the day before. We want to see ourselves positively, and so we want to see the groups we belong to positively as well. And so if we're a liberal, if we're a Democrat, and Barack Obama is a Democrat, we want to see him in a positive light. And so if we want to see him positively, and if lightness or whiteness is associated with positive things, then our brains might actually see him as, or imagine him as being lighter skinned than he actually is. And so Eugene Caruso is saying here that group membership, whether it's our own group membership or others, actually is a lens through which we see reality. Okay, so again, there's an important idea here that we have all this programming happening below the surface, but it doesn't stay there, right? It kind of changes the way we see the world, right? We're actually seeing the world through our ideas, if you will. Okay, we're seeing the world through our socialization. Okay, crazy stuff. Okay, quick question for you here. Now, we're talking about prejudice, we're talking about discrimination, so people being treated differently because of the social groups that they belong to. And so I know it's been a few days since we saw this movie, but can you think of any examples of discrimination in Mean Girls? Were instances where people were treated differently based on the social group they belong to, or something about them? There's a bunch of them, actually, but see if you can think of some of them. So the Asians are smart, right? There's a whole social group that are the Asian nerds, right? And so that's a kind of I guess that's a bit of a prejudicial idea, but it's an example of a positive one, right? Because we're not saying they're bad because of that. We're saying they're good because of that. Karen says thus are ugly or no. Okay, so yeah, the Asian nerds is a bit of that's a double-edged sword, right? Being smart is good, and so that's positive, but the nerdiness is not so good, right? So to be an Asian nerd is to have positive and negative ideas associated with you. The lesbian girl, how was she discriminated against? Baha. That was Janice. How was Janice discriminated against? Because you're right. She definitely was. Okay. Oh, yeah. She was not. Yeah, she was not accepted by the plastics. Right. There was that. There was that scene where Regina was talking to Katie, and she said that she couldn't invite Janice to her pool party because she was a lesbian, right? And so she was actually pushed out of Regina's group of friends because of this social group that she was supposed to belong to. And I think it's not clear in the movie, but I don't think she's I don't think she's gay. I don't think she's a lesbian. Um, if you remember right at the end um, when she's dancing with Kevin Napur, the captain of the mathletes, and he asks if she's Puerto Rican, and she says no, I'm Lebanese, which of course sounds like lesbian. So I think that was kind of the joke, is that Janice isn't she's not lesbian, she's Lebanese. Um, I'm not sure if that's the joke or not. I'm not sure if that's what they're trying to tell us there. Um, but yeah, she was not accepted. She was excluded based on um, what they perceived her sexuality to be. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But um, there's a few more examples of this. But I'll tell you what. Why don't I? Why don't we take a little break? We'll take a 10-minute break here. Stretch your legs. Do what you need to do. But um, think about other examples of discrimination in Mean Girls if you can, and then maybe when we come back, maybe we'll have a few more. Okay, so let's take a quick break, and I'll see you shortly. Okay. Okay, and we're back. Um, okay, so we're talking about prejudice and discrimination here, right? And we talked about the resume study, and we said that um, these two researchers sent out a bunch of resumes to help wanted ads in Chicago and Boston. And what they found was white names were much more likely to be called back for interviews than black names. And again, the explanation that was given, and I think this is kind of important to understand, is that discrimination was happening very clearly against Black Americans in that study, right? And we saw it across occupational types, and we saw it in both cities. The pattern was basically the same. Now, why did that happen? Well, were some people being racist? Again, yeah, they probably were. There's always a few. But is that the only issue? No. The other issue is that discrimination is happening, and in many cases, it's likely happening without people knowing or without people being aware of it. And so this is kind of, I wanted to just reaffirm that point because I think that's a little bit of what's happening in the United States when we're talking about police brutality and how police departments operate, and how Black Americans are much more likely to be treated negatively by police departments. And so some people are, they're using this term like, there's a few bad apples. And yeah, there definitely are, right? We have video footage of one killing a black man in the street, right? That's kind of what sparked this whole situation. And so, are there some bad police officers? Yeah, there are, right? There's always a few bad people anywhere you go. But does that mean that the rest of the police department is, innocent of any wrongdoing? Well, no, not necessarily, right? And why? Because people sometimes discriminate unconsciously, right? And there are more elements to this as well. But what I'm trying to explain here is that when we're looking for causes of inequality, usually there are multiple factors involved, okay? And so if we're saying, well, this is the problem here and this is the only problem, that's usually not the case. The cause of these problems is often very complex, and there's often multiple causes to one thing. And so what we see in the States, again, some people want to say, oh, there's just a few bad cops. Yeah, there probably are a few bad cops. Maybe there's even more than a few, but there are other problems as well, right? And that are leading to this situation. It's not just one thing. And it's the same thing with this hiring situation. It's not just that there are a few it's not that a few hiring managers are racist. Yeah, they probably are, but a lot of people are discriminating in ways that they're probably not aware of. Okay, and that's what makes this more difficult. Karen says, an airline company can't say that they have a few bad apples for pilots who can deliberately crash the plane. Yeah, that's a very important point, right? Is that the bad apples defense also assumes that that's okay, right? And again, people, some professions don't get to say that, right? They don't get to say that there's a few bad apples who are allowed to crash the plane, right? And so you're right, Karen, and that's actually another way of I guess it's another way of kind of poking a hole in an argument or a premise that people are trying to present to us, right? We talked about critical thinking. Some people are trying to say, yes, there is a problem with how police departments interact with Black Americans, but it's because of a few bad apples, right? That's what they're trying to convince us of. And Karen, that's a good criticism, right? Is that, not all professions have that ability to just say, oh well, it's just a few bad ones, right? You can't have planes falling out of the sky because you have a few bad pilots, right? That's not allowed. And so similarly, it's not a legitimate defense of what's happening in the States. Very true. Yeah. Okay. So let's not belabor that point. I'm done with that. But I'm glad you mentioned that, Karen, because that's important. Okay. So we talked about the hiring thing, and then we talked about Obama, and is Barack Obama black or white? And again, he has presented himself to the community as black, but interestingly, people see him differently depending on whether their political views align with him and kind of whether they like him, right? Whether they see him as one of their own or not. Again, which is really interesting, and it may expose an idea of whiteness or lightness associated positively, and the idea that we like to see members of our group more favorably, because if the people in our group are cool, that must mean we're cool, basically, right? That's what's being said. And so right before we went on break, I switched us back to Mean Girls, and I said, are there examples of discrimination that happen in Mean Girls that you can think of? And Baha had one. He said that we talked about Janice, right? And Janice was not accepted by the Plastics. She was not allowed to come to Regina's pool party. And why? Because Regina thought she was gay, thought she was a lesbian, right? So Janice was discriminated against. Did you come up with any others? There's a few. I know it's hard to remember, though. It's hard to remember. I'll give you a few seconds, and then the girl that Regina yeah, so the girl that got punched by Regina, is that the girl who said that she got punched in the face by Regina once and it was awesome? I don't know if that's discrimination. I think it's probably more random violence. It's definitely not okay. But yeah, I think that's just random violence on the part of Regina, because she's kind of a horrible person. Here's a few examples. So at the beginning of the movie, Katie gets invited to sit with the Plastics. And why? Well, because she's pretty, right? Being part of the Plastics, that's true, Karen. It could have been the way she looked. Actually, okay, that's true. Okay, hang on to that. Let's hang on to that for a second, Karen. I think you might be right. So Katie's invited to sit with the Plastics because she's pretty, right? Part of being in that group, part of that group's identity is attractiveness and fashion, right? And so in order for Katie to be accepted into the group, she has to be pretty, right? And so they actually discriminate against Katie, but positively, right? They invite her in specifically because she's pretty and she'll make them look good. And so I guess that's where this point comes in here, Karen, is that, the girl who got punched in the face may have been punched in the face because of the way she looks. Or similarly, there's lots of other girls in the school who are not invited to join the Plastics because the Plastics don't think they're pretty enough, right? So that could be discrimination as well. So, okay, I'll take that. Katie gets invited to join the Mathletes because she's a girl. And they actually say it, right? Remember, I don't know if it's Kevin Napur who says it or if it's Miss Norbury who says it, But they say that, oh, if we have a girl on the team, we get extra funding, we get extra money, and we want jackets this year. So they are positively discriminating against Katie. They're trying to get her into their group of mathletes just because she's a girl. Yes, she's good at math too, so there's that. But she's discriminated. She's brought into the group specifically because she's a girl. This is Baja's here. Janice is not invited to the pool party because people perceive her to be a lesbian, whether she is or not. Remember the store that they go to where Regina tries on the dress, but she's been eating all of those Swedish energy bars or whatever, and so she doesn't fit into it. And so the store is called 135 because it only carries dress sizes 1, 3, and 5. And so guys, you may or may not know anything about this, but girls, you'll definitely know that sizes 1, 3, and 5 are not very big. If you're a size 1, you are tiny, and 3 is pretty small, and 5 is still smaller than probably the average woman. And so the store kind of discriminates, right? They only sell clothing for people who are really slim and really kind of tiny, right? Women who are larger or women who are heavier, they're discriminated against at this store. There's nothing there that will fit them. Kevin Napur, he says it at the party, I think, when Katie thinks that Kevin has a crush on her, and he says, no, sorry, I only date women of color, right? So Kevin Napur discriminates, right? Because he says he doesn't date white girls. And so there's probably more evidence of discrimination in that movie, but I just thought I would bring it up. Okay, so here's another important aspect of oppression that we will need to understand, and it's the concept of privilege. And now, you may have heard talk about privilege in association with definitely racism and probably sexism and other things. And I think it's also a concept that is sometimes difficult to understand, and difficult for people to imagine, particularly people who are in the dominant group. Because oftentimes when it's working, when privilege is happening, it's invisible. Okay, you don't really notice that it's happening in many cases. And so because many people, especially people in the dominant group, because they don't experience privilege, because they don't see it or feel it, it's difficult to understand. It's difficult to kind of experience, okay? But it is important to, in understanding how oppression operates, especially kind of a more of on the ground kind of level. So here's what I would like you to do. I have an article, a short article for you to read, and it's called Understanding Race and Privilege. And so I've placed this article on Student Portal under course documents, and I've also placed it in the files section of Microsoft Teams. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read this article. It's not super long. And then at the end of the article, I have a few questions for you to answer. Okay. And so I'd like to ask you to read the article, answer the questions, type them out so that we can put them into the live chat, and then we'll talk about what this privilege thing. We'll talk about what it is, and we'll try to understand it. Okay. Now, by the time you do that, I think we'll be out of time, and so what I think I'll do is I'll give you the rest of today's class to read that article and to answer your questions. And then tomorrow we'll jump right in at the beginning of class and we'll start to answer them. The micropaper thing, I'll also have to do that tomorrow too. Sometimes I think things will take less time than they do, which is a problem of mine, but anyway. We'll deal with that tomorrow as well. So tomorrow is privilege and the micropaper. Today I'll give you the rest of the class to finish or to read that article and to answer the questions. Again, type them up, and then we will take it up first thing tomorrow. Before we kind of break, does anyone have any questions? Did everything that I said today make sense? Was any of it confusing? Is there anything you would like to say to clarify something? Because some of the things that we've talked about today are complicated, and sometimes people have kind of different understandings of how these things work. And so I just want to make sure that what I said was clear and that everyone understands and that everyone is okay. And so can you just let me know in the comments there if everything's all right and if you understand and if you're okay with what we've talked about today? Or if you have any questions, toss a question in there, and I will do my best to answer it as well as I can anyway. Okay, so Karen says, difference between stereotypes and prejudice. The short answer, Karen, is that it has to do with value judgment. So whether you attach kind of a positive or negative judgment of those people to your stereotype. Sometimes it's a bit of a gray area. I don't think that I don't think I would ever ask you, is this a stereotype or a prejudice? I don't think that's useful. So sometimes they're very clearly separate. Sometimes there's a bit of a gray area in between. But I think prejudicial ones, the way I see it is that they're very similar, but prejudicial ones are judgmental. And so they cause people to discriminate. They cause people to either positively or negatively discriminate because people make a judgment about certain people being good or bad based on their prejudicial ideas. That's kind of how I understand it anyway, and I might be wrong, but that's how I understand it. I hope that works. Okay, so Casey's good, Sam's good, Tika's good, Rashid is good. What else? Anything else? The other thing I'll say too very quickly is you can always, Baha's okay, all right. You can always ask me questions if you're confused about something. Some of the things we talk about in this class, particularly as we head into the racism stuff, there is a possibility for people to kind of become emotionally involved and maybe get upset about things. And it's also possible for us to misunderstand each other, right? It's possible for me to say something and for me to say it wrong, or for you to not kind of understand what I'm saying. And so if anything I say is confusing, or if it bothers you, or if you're not sure about it, always ask. You cannot offend or upset me. So, we're here to learn. So if something comes up and you're not sure about it, or you don't understand something, by all means ask, and we will sort it out. Okay. Okay. I think we're all right. So I'll let you read that article. Again, it's called, what's it called? Understanding Race and Privilege is what it's called. It's in Student Portal. It's on Microsoft Teams under Files. Read the article, answer the questions, type them up, and we'll deal with them first thing tomorrow morning, okay? Which will be Friday. Okay, so it was lovely talking with you all this morning. Thank you for interacting in the live chat. I guess I'll see some of you in Comparative Cultures in about half an hour. Other than that, I will see you tomorrow, okay? So, bye.